Today in Science 9, we're going to talk about how organisms compete for niches. The reason that we're doing this is so we can understand how organisms are able to adapt to their environments. So, a common refrain that you'll hear from scientists, but especially from biologists, is just a reminder about the difference between a theory and a hypothesis. When we talk about a theory in science, a theory is not a guess. Gravity is a theory. No one is guessing about how gravity works. We know how gravity works in detail, in excruciating detail. It's not a guess, but it is the theory of gravity. And that's because scientific theories are actually explanations. Explanations of the mechanic and the hows and the whys of why things happen in the world. When we make a prediction or an educated guess, that, of course, is our hypothesis. And the important thing to remember about a good hypothesis as well is it's not random. It's based off of previous observation and previous knowledge. So, this is important because we're going to talk about variation and competition, and that does eventually lead us to the theory of evolution through natural selection. So, variation is one of the reasons it's important is because of competition. Not all organisms are always able to get what they need to survive and reproduce. It can be sad, especially with cute organisms, but that is the way of life. Not everything can get what it needs in order to reproduce. So organisms end up competing with one another. Because those resources are then limited, only the organisms that are able to get enough food, water, shelter, mates, are able to survive and go on to have babies. Variation is what determines how much of those resources an organism gets. Organisms survive based off of their differing variations. And that's one of the reasons diversity is so important, because that means that different organisms are actually adapted for different conditions. What's an advantage in one area might be a disadvantage in another. Think about the example from last video, polar bear and black bear. Well, polar bear's white fur is definitely an advantage in a snowy region, really good at ice insulating it. Not so good when it's super hot in the middle of the Calgarian summer. So that's an example of a variation that's very useful in one environment and is a disadvantage in another one. Like we said as well, the niche that an organism fulfills is directly linked to the environment that it lives. So, when different organisms survive at different rates and they reproduce at different rates, that leads to what we call the theory of evolution by natural selection. Natural selection occurs when some organisms survive and reproduce and other organisms of the same species don't. And what that means is that only the most beneficial variations get passed on from generation to generation. We call those best adapted organisms the fittest. And you've probably heard of the phrase survival of the fittest. A common misconception, though, is that fittest means strongest. It doesn't necessarily. Fittest means best able to survive in that niche, in that environment. So the fittest might be the strongest in some niches, but it might also be the smallest or the fastest or the cleverest. Other organisms can survive in an ecosystem But in order for multiple organisms to survive in the ecosystem, they need to fulfill different niches. Because if they try to fulfill the same niche, they end up competing and clashing with each other for resources, most notably food, but other ones as well. If an organism fulfills a different niche, though, that means that they don't have to compete directly. This is what we were seeing about the eagle and the owl in the last video, too. The eagle and the owl, even though they're very similar organisms, they even have similar hunting strategies and food, they hunt at different types of day. So, different times of day, you'll have the eagle out or you'll have the owl out. And that ensures that they're not trying to compete for the same food source. They are avoiding competition. This is behavioral. This is a behavioral avoidance of competition, but it will lead to subtle changes in the organisms. So that you can behave differently by eating in a different location or being active at a different time of day. And that influences the variations that are useful and that are going to be fittest in that region. You see this with birds a lot. These warblers each live and feed in a different part of the tree. They'll make their nest in a different part of the tree as well. So that means that they're not competing for spaces for the nests too. So that is one way of avoiding competition right there. Some organisms have to have really broad niches. In Calgary, we have lots of really highly variable weather. We see this all the time. You can go from being 30 degrees out to snows on the ground in less than a week. Organisms that want to live in that type of environment need to be generalists. They need to have extremely broad niches and be very adaptable to changing conditions. Other times, organisms have very narrow niches. If you live in the tropics, you don't have to deal with changing seasons, so species can specialize more. We say these have very narrow niches because they're highly specialized and they have a very narrow set of conditions that they need to stay in. If you take a Galapagos tortoise and try and get it to live in Calgary, it's not going to end well because the tortoise is very well adapted to its specific location. But even if you take the tortoise from the Galapagos to the mainland, it's probably not going to do great either. Because even though the climate's very similar on mainland South America as the Galapagos, the species and the organisms are all very different. You've already pushed that animal out of its comfort zone. And that's the danger of becoming overly specialized. It can cripple a species if the environment changes dramatically and they're not able to survive it. It can also be very dangerous in the case of invasive species. Organisms with really broad niches are really adaptable. So if you take them somewhere where they don't have predators and everything else has a narrow niche, they're just going to outcompete everything else. And that's how we get invasive species. That's also how we get, like a lot of weeds in North America, are species that have been brought over from Europe and Asia, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Settlers brought a lot of them with them because those were the plants they were used to growing. But they've just taken off and become weeds all over the place because they outcompete and kill off the native species.